So welcome Andrew Ewing to the World Health Network, Professor of Chemistry and Molecular Biology at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Thanks for joining us tonight to talk about the possible effects on the brain with COVID-19.
Documented, I mean, there's been a lot of documentation on COVID effects on the brain. And what I'm going to talk to you tonight is some of the literature that I've been collecting on this over the last 2 years. We've known for a long time that this is affecting the brain. And this was a Nature News article from 2021 in the middle of the year, where they talked about it and made it clear that we really didn't understand, and we still don't understand exactly how the COVID or SARS Cov2 attacks the brain. Okay, although I'll give you a couple of different ideas here, and there's different evidence in each area. I have my own opinion of what's going on, and I'm pretty sure it's right, but we'll go through that. But it clearly reduces the blood flow to the brain and cuts down the metabolism in the brain, and this happens in adults and children. It results in memory loss and strokes and other effects on the brain. I'll show you some of that. With so many people affected, you have neurological symptoms in probably 80% of the people that are hospitalized with COVID-19. Okay, some neurological symptoms and damage are the result of the body's own immune system overreacting or autoimmune type interactions. And that's becoming more and more apparent. And so there's three sort of basic areas and several things that it does. Can I have the next slide, please? This was something from the summer of 2020. So really early on, we knew about this. Okay, this is in Annals of Neurology. And they listed neurological conditions associated with infection by SARS Cov2, and it, they have encephalopathy, encephalitis, viral meningitis, stroke. Next slide, please. Anosmia, edema, okay, headache type presentations, okay, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and muscle injury. So we knew all this right up front. So it's not a big revelation for this, and it's amazing that we haven't had policy that has been driven by, at least in part, by this. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is from a paper in November last year, so fairly recent, and it talks about how COVID-19 affects the brain. And I split COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2 because we're not sure exactly whether SARS-CoV-2, the virus, gets into the brain, although I think it does. But there's mixed evidence. But clearly the infection, the COVID-19 infection, does affect the brain. And I'm going to talk about this in a couple of different ways. And I have two slides, one now, one later. The direct infection is one pathway. And they talk about this in part one, okay, with viral loads in the oral cavity. The olfactory nerves don't have the ACE2 receptor. So the idea that it goes in through the ACE2 receptor into the olfactory nerves, which was originally thought, is probably not correct. But it does cause inflammation in the mucosal membrane in the nose, okay? And this could easily cause this inflammation, breakdown of some of the barriers and entry into the brain. And so this is sort of the mechanism across the top. SARS-CoV-2 also causes vascular damage, and I'm going to show you some of the evidence for this. And of course, if you damage the blood vessels, which make up the blood-brain barrier, some of the SARS-CoV-2 could get into the brain, okay? And cause all of these different things over here in the lower right in the blue box. The thing is that the argument comes down to when people look at samples of cerebral spinal fluid from patients with COVID-19, they don't find, so far, they haven't been able to find the virus. But post-mortem analysis very clearly shows in many papers that the virus is in the brain. But a lot of people, including a lot of neuroscientists, argue that the post-mortem analysis is flawed, that things break down after the person dies and the virus could be entering. And so there's issues there. But you can make up your own mind when I'm done with my talk. Can I have the next slide, please? Here is one thing. I mean, now, however whatever causes this, and all my animations are gone. Okay, and so what this is studies of microvascular injury in brains of patients who have died from COVID-19. So this is all post-mortem, and the red arrows point you to the sort of main things that I want to point here. Panel B, okay, shows immunofluorescence imaging. The panel B imaging showing fibrinogen leakage, which is something that only leaks if the blood vessels are damaged, and they're shown in green. And then collagen 4 in yellow, okay, which shows where these are. And this is in panel B and B1, okay. And so you can see it with the blow up here. There's a lot of vascular damage that is apparent in this slide. And this actually is a total of 19 different patients that were used to take these types of slides. Okay, panel D, okay, is fibrinogen staining, again, vascular damage. Panel I, if you go down here now this is mRNA. EM imaging, okay, shows CD3 plus cells in the cerebellum coming through, okay, and these would only come through because they're not normally there if there was vascular injury. So this is all data that suggests that this is happening. There's been some actual live patient scans with MRI that suggest vascular damage as well. I'm not going to show those. There's a lot of evidence for this now. Can I have the next slide, please? There. Okay. Now this is something this is published in 2021, but was done in 2020. So it was early on, but this is something that was very highly publicized on social media, and it shows the cognitive effects caused by COVID. A lot of people attacked it, but I think a lot of the people who attacked it were people who probably had COVID and didn't want to believe that they'd lost an average of 7 points on their IQ score. But this is what they have is kind of interesting. The UK keeps a lot of information, and so they have something called the Great Britain Intelligence Test, and they've been running this for some time. And they ran from January to December of 2020 and collected data on 81,337 patients. And what this test does is it tests a series of different intelligence scores, from spatial problem solving over on the upper left, then moving over spatial planning, then working memory, short-term memory, visual attention, spatially manipulating objects, mentally reasoning, identifying word meaning, and emotion identification. Okay. And then they come up with a global score. And it's kind of complicated how they do it if you look through the paper. But the bottom line results are pretty interesting. Can I have the next slide, please? And I just selected out one plot from the paper, which is sort of like the big plot that was shown a lot. I added a little to it and took away a little bit of the confusing stuff. But if you look here, this is cognitive deficits. So this is loss in ability to use your brain, basically. And the symptoms, okay, it has patients that had symptoms. Most of the patients actually did not have symptoms. Okay, we're not hospitalized anyway. That's the three on the left. Okay, and it goes in increasing levels of severity from the left to the right. So on the right, it's people who went to the hospital and were put on a ventilator, went to the hospital next to that but were not put on a ventilator, etc. And then they have the standard on the left side. They have the standard deviation units. Okay, and this is the amount that this changes. Okay, from the controls. Okay, from people that were not under any of these conditions. And they point out in the paper that a 0.4 change in the standard deviation is equivalent to losing 7 points in IQ, as it shows on the right side. They also point out that the amount of loss that you're seeing here in these two bars on the right side is a greater than what you see in loss in ability to in your cognitive ability or ability to use your brain. Okay, simply put, for greater than 10 years of aging. Okay, from when you're going from age 20 to 70. So this is a fairly substantial change, okay, in cognitive ability that you're seeing, and it definitely goes with severity. Can I have the next slide, please? So then there's a paper that came out in the middle of last year, which looked at 5 months and at 12 months different post long COVID or post COVID symptoms. Okay, and they included a lot of brain related things. Can I have the next slide, please? Where I blow it up. Okay, and so I've circled these, but you have decrease in taste and smell, fatigue. Fatigue is huge in long COVID, and it's probably partly muscle, but partly brain. Concentration problems. If you I've talked to a lot of post-COVID people who have told me that one of the biggest problems they've had is concentration even after a long period, after months. Difficulty finding words, headache, vertigo, anxiety, and we'll come to anxiety in a little bit. Now, this chart is split up on the left with acute COVID, then at 5 months, then at 12 months, and down here it's split up into mild, moderate versus severe, critical, male, female, age less than 60, greater than 60, and then this anti-nuclear antibody, okay, which is something to do with antibodies that are self-attacking cells. I won't go into that in any detail. But if you look here, it's a heat map, and on the right side, there's a percentage of patients. And the darker red, okay, from 50% on, is present in a lot of these. Look at fatigue, even at 12 months, okay, in these patients. If you look at concentration problems, it's still there. Difficulty finding words. This is a huge thing that's taking place in this. Can I have the next slide, please? So this was a paper published in the Lancet Psychiatry last year that seems to have been overlooked for the most part. But it's psychiatric outcomes, and these increase after COVID infection. Now, the percentages of patients that actually have these are small, but the percentage of the human race that gets each of these is relatively small. You can see that on the y-axis here, 0.4, 1.5, et cetera. But there's some big changes. The blue here is the control patients that have not had COVID, and the red are patients that have had COVID, and each of these, and it has intracranial hemorrhage, ischemic stroke, nerve root, and plexus disorders all put together, myoneural junction or muscle disease. Look at the difference there, enormous. Dementia, look at the difference there. It's very large. Mood or anxiety, okay, or psychotic disorders. If you add these up, I mean, it's bad enough to look and see the difference here. It almost doubles, or in the case of myoneural junction or muscle disease, it goes up about 5-fold. But if you look at the total number of patients, on the right side, I have a little bit of a legend here. And after 6 months, okay, those that had neurological or psychiatric diagnosis was 34%, and 13% of those had the first such diagnosis. So even if you want to argue that, okay, they might have had this before, but not all these diagnoses are recurrent, okay, normally. So that part of the 34% are new in a sense, or wouldn't have happened without COVID. It's pretty clear. But the 13% are brand new. And if for patients who had been admitted to the ICU, okay, So this is just patients diagnosed up above, but if they're in the ICU, it's worse. It's 46 and 26%. Okay, there's a huge change in psychiatric outcomes. And you know, a lot of people argue, oh, this isn't possible because you'd have a lot of psychotic people running around. That's because they don't understand what it means to have a change in your psychiatry. Okay, the change is something that you know, you probably have friends and family that have psychiatric issues, and we all do. And but what we're doing is we're increasing that by a great deal when we have so many people having COVID. Can I have the next slide, please? This is from a paper on loss of gray matter after COVID infection. And I'm going to talk about white matter later too, but gray matter are the cell bodies, where the parts of the nerve cells start out. And then the axons that go from there, the long stretches along or branches on the tree, those are usually myelinated, and the myelin sheath helps the transmission of signals along the axons. And so it's white, and it's white in color, okay, when you look at the brain, or relatively, okay, so they call it white and gray matter. But the gray matter represents the cells, how many of the brain cells you have. And what they showed in this paper was that there was a significant loss in gray matter after the COVID infection. And it happened after both mild and severe COVID infections. And it happened in regions of the brain that were related to loss of smell, but also loss or memory. Okay, and so this all fits together. It all fits together very nicely. Now, images like this are extremely difficult to interpret. Okay, but if you look, they had some interpretations that I could both understand and agree with, and that's on the next slide, please. Here now they're scanning brain scan volumes based on this. Okay, and the top are controls, and the bottoms are the COVID patients. And one of the things that they use for neurodegeneration studies is to look at the ratio of brain to total intracranial volume. And when you have neurodegeneration, this volume decreases. And you look on the left here, and it's startling. I mean, the decrease is much faster for COVID patients than for normal controls. We all have it decreasing. Our brains degenerate as we age, unfortunately. But this is faster with COVID patients. You also have the part of the cerebellum, which the crust-2 part of the cerebellum, which is an interesting one because it doesn't normally degenerate and lose in volume, but with COVID patients it does. So I thought this was kind of interesting to toss in as well. Can I have the next slide, please? So there's a really cool paper that came out in January and was put on Twitter by the Iwasaki, Professor Iwasaki, who's done some real nice work in virology. And she put on this idea of or this comparison of different ways that COVID or SARS Cov2 could be affecting the brain. And one is direct infection, which I talked about before. And one is autoimmunity, which I mentioned, and I won't talk about too much because we really are just figuring it out. And the other is distal inflammation. So inflammation that is from the lungs, the heart, whatever, affecting the brain through different things that are different chemicals that are released that'll go up and affect the brain. And in this work here, they actually looked at a model of mild respiratory SARS-CoV-2 infection with a mouse. Okay, they used a mouse model, and they looked at this to see what it would do in terms of affecting the brain and the cells in the brain. And I want to show you this and try to put it in a little bit of context. So they in this case, they looked at just the distal inflammation, and they have a mechanism for this. Can I have the next slide, please? And so what they did is they either injected into the intratracheal or intranasal, into the nose, okay, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And then they took cerebral spinal fluid samples, that's in the upper middle, or they killed the mouse, they sacrificed the mouse, and they looked at slices through the brain of the mouse. Now, the first thing that they wanted to point out is that the body weight didn't change. That's in the lower left. And then they looked for scans. They looked for with a DAPI stain, okay, and to see the nuclei in the cells, and then a SARS Cov2 stain to look at for the N protein, to look for it in the brain, and they didn't see it. Okay, so they assumed that this was a distal infection. Then they looked at a number of different things, and I can't show you them all. It's a really exciting paper, but I'll show you a few. They looked at cytokines, and cytokine, we all heard about the cytokine storm with this COVID-19 infection disease, but here they looked at the different cytokines that changed, and they looked at them at 7 days. That's in the middle upper, and there are two in the middle really, and they looked at them at 7 weeks. And in the top part here, they looked at them in the serum, the blood serum, and they looked at it in the bottom in the cerebral spinal fluid. And you can see, it's kind of interesting, they have the control in each case on the left and the mild on the right. And you see a number of these cytokines go up, some of them really significantly. At 7 days, they're way up, some of them, and then down a little bit, but they're still elevated quite a bit at 7 weeks. And that's really important, okay? So they're there for a long time. Can I have the next slide, please? So if you look on the left, I've written about 4 slides worth of data, okay, as a summary. But they observed something called reactive microglia. These are these small cells that are normally in the brain for different types of cells, or support cells and so forth, and often the immune cells of the brain. And these reactive microglia usually indicate that bad things are happening, okay? And they observed these in both the mouse model and in human postmortem COVID-19 patients. Some of the patients were mild patients that died from other reasons, okay? And they saw them go up. Reactive microglia can inhibit memory formation. So that's what I'm focusing on here. Because then what they did is they went and they looked for something called neuroblasts, which are cells that are created when you create memories. You involve stem cells and they call these neuroblasts. Okay, I'm just to make it simplified. And these are decreased in COVID patients, both at 7 days and 7 weeks, and that's what this slide shows. It shows the control in the pictures here, the images. They show the controls. You can see lots of these purple spots. They're the neuroblasts, and the mild, there's only a few of them. Down at 7 weeks, same thing. In fact, it's almost worse. It's about the same for the control, but there's even less in the mild COVID. This is really, really startling result when I saw it. And they've taken averages of these, okay, across the image, and they show in the middle here control versus mild COVID. Now, this is a mild infection in the mouse, okay? It's not a severe infection, and you can see it drops off, the neuroblasts drop off a lot. These are associated with memory formation, and so this fits perfectly with the observational data that I showed you before. Can I have the next slide, please? So what's happening? Well, one hypothesis is that chemokine, or a cytokine called chemokine CCL11, okay, which reduces neurogenesis, was itself elevated, which would mean it would reduce the formation of these cells that are involved in memory. In the cerebral spinal fluid of mice 7 weeks and after mild and respiratory infection, okay. And also, they also showed this reduced in human patients, or elevated in human patients with long COVID brain fog. So they took in patients that were that said they still had the brain fog, and they looked at them. That's a little bit harder thing to do because you're relying on people's memory of their memory. Okay, but okay. If you look on the mouse CSF, huge increase. That's very clear. And the human patients, where you have a little bit more of an issue of determining, it's still statistically significant increase, okay, in this. So what can lead to impaired neurogenesis? Well, this CCL11 is elevated, and that's very likely to be one of the issues that's taking place. Can I have the next slide, please? So the other thing they found, and really is just startling, and this slide has got an animation, so we won't be able to use it. But oligodendrocytes are the cells that wrap around neuronal axons to make myelin, and they're really important for your nerve cells to transmit in the way our brains are set up. And when you lose them, okay, and an example of a disease where you lose myelin, okay, which is the myelin sheath made by the oligodendrocytes, you get, and a disease that does this is ALS, okay, and ALS is eventually fatal. It's a very bad disease, okay. So I'm going to start out there in these diseases. These are decreased in the model here, okay. They're decreased. The white matter is the part where you have these myelin sheaths, as opposed to the gray matter I talked about before. And you see that at 7 days on the top and 7 weeks, you have a decrease in there's not a decrease at 7 days, but there is in 7 weeks a little bit of a decrease of the pre-cells for the oligodendrocytes, the cells that make the oligodendrocytes. But if you look at the oligodendrocytes themselves in the middle, they're already down at 7 days, and they're down at 7 weeks, okay? And then if you look at the bottom, where they actually looked at images and counted the axons that had myelin sheaths on them, you see that the axons with myelin sheaths have decreased. So basically in these mice, they've been creating the beginning of the ALS disease, okay? Now, one of the things that I need to point out is this was all done, okay, okay, this is an ALS, multiple sclerosis, okay, I'm saying ALS sort of the same, okay, and not the same, but it's related. But the incidence and severity, okay, is not clear with Omicron, although there's no reason to think that Omicron would be different, because Omicron's difference is really that it affects the upper respiratory system versus the lower respiratory system. And so it's not clear exactly what this will mean in terms of looking at this for the same kinds of experiments, which they have not done. This is all pre-Omicron. Can I have the next slide, please? Next slide, please.
Oh, it didn't advance. Hang on.
No.
I'm advancing it, and it's going back. Let me.
Oh,
is this it?
Yeah. Okay.
With the builds, that was the problem. I got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just briefly, there's a paper in ACS Chemical Neuroscience where they did a lot of what they call fluorescence resonance energy transfer imaging, and looked at both in the test tube and in cells, and they found that alpha-synuclein, which is a protein that is involved in Parkinson's disease, interacts with the N protein, the nucleocapsid protein of SARS Cov2, to make amyloids, which is what we find created in both Parkinson's disease and different types of amyloids in Alzheimer's disease. Can I have the next slide, please? And a number of studies have suggested COVID and Parkinson's disease are related. This slide shows that brain inflammation, okay, is caused by SARS Cov2, okay, and this is all post-mortem analysis of real COVID patients, okay, but here they show T cells in the top and activated microglia again being found in the pituitary gland, the perivascular, the intraparenchyma, the pituitary gland again, the olfactory bulb, and the intraparenchymal cells in the region in the brain, okay, and then on the bottom they show the formation of Lewy bodies, okay, so they're actually finding these Lewy bodies, which are a hallmark of Parkinson's disease, after an asymptomatic infection in monkeys, okay, so this is a model, but they've done this and they looked at these post-mortem images to find these, to see that these are being created, okay. So the next slide, please. There's a lot of more data on this, but just gives you an idea that this is being worked on. This is a complicated slide to show in this format, but amyloidogenic peptides have been identified in the proteome of SARS-CoV-2, okay, and this has implications for neurological symptoms in COVID-19, but also has implications for onset of Alzheimer's disease. And if you look at what I've put on the over here, if this is neuroinvasive, okay, it's possible that we're creating amyloids in the brain. If the N capsid protein of SARS-CoV-2 is getting into the brain, we are probably making amyloids, because we see from their experiments that you can form these, okay, and these are cytotoxic, okay, so that means they kill the cells, and they're it's moving. The outlook in relation to triggering the progressive neurodegenerative diseases is uncertain, but the slow progress of neurodegenerative diseases means that we probably won't see this for like a decade or so, maybe 5, 10, 15 years. And so but I would predict that at least some, I don't know what percentage, but you're going to have a percentage of people that are going to have this. But let me show you the last couple slides. Next slide, please. This is data from the military in the U.S., okay, and when they do autopsies, okay, on people that have died for whatever reason, they test them to see if they have COVID. Okay, I'm not sure why, but they do this, and they do a brain scan. And what they did is they looked here, and they looked at, this is what they call 10 young patients. So these patients were all under 60 years old. So they're relatively young. The youngest, I think, was 37. Yeah, 37 years old. Can I have the next slide, because it gives a better figure legend. So this is the section of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That's the front of your brain, where you have a lot of your it's not memory formation, but probably memory storage and things like this. And a place where you typically find a lot of beta amyloid in Alzheimer's patients. And so the cortical surface is just above the top of the figure, and the subcortical white matter is at the bottom of the figure. Okay, so I blocked off the top now. But this section is representative of the entire neocortex, however. Okay, and that's really important. So this is what they see. The inset shows a higher magnification of the boxed area, which is to the left, and they show one of these amyloid plaque type formations in here. And so in 10 patients, now they did this in 10 COVID patients, and 10 out of 10 had this. All right. Now, in the 10 COVID patients that they looked at, they found the one that was the 58-year-old woman that died from something else, but then they discovered had COVID. But the other patients were in intensive care and had breathing problems. So they pointed out that there could be issues with lack of oxygen that causes this. But at this point, it's really hard to resist the urge to say, wow, these things are being formed because of the COVID, especially with the data I showed you before, or the evidence I showed you before. Can I have the next slide, please? So it gets a little worse, okay? There's Alzheimer's-like signaling in the brains of COVID patients. And I'm just showing you this, but you can go look on this paper on Alzheimer's and dementia. It's sort of an not a normal publication, I guess. I'm not really sure, but it was a very interesting paper. And they talk about COVID-19 causing inflammation, which causes reactive oxygen species, that's this ROS, to be released, which then affects something called ryanodine receptors, the RYR2, which are calcium channels, okay? They open calcium channels, which can cause a lot of changes and things like apoptosis and so forth. And this is probably affecting the brain, the lungs, the heart, etc. And so they talk about this in terms of long-term effects of COVID-19 on causing things like brain fog, okay? But this activation, what this does is it activates something called the TGF beta signaling pathway, okay, which is also something that happens in Alzheimer's disease. Okay, really interesting as they say, an atypical, a forma fruste, I learned some new word here, of Alzheimer's disease. And it might predispose long COVID patients to developing Alzheimer's disease later in life. It's not a pleasant prospect, okay? It's not, this data combined is not pleasant at all. Next slide, please. So how much do vaccines improve distal control of SARS-CoV-2? This is a really complicated issue, okay? Because they, on the left side here, they have vaccines on the, and you have fully vaccinated in the yellow, purple is partially vaccinated, one shot, and unvaccinated is green. The one shot doesn't seem to help at all. The two shots seems to be better. Of course, vaccines wane. They also are looking at symptoms and not really damage. We don't know. I mean, we need to look at the tissues to see whether it's changing this for long-term effects, et cetera. But it does look like at least some of the long COVID brain effects are diminished if you're fully vaccinated. So that looks good from this study. If you look on the right side, there's a study in mice where they show that the SARS COVID vaccines in the mice don't prevent the breakthrough infections. Well, that's not a big surprise. A spike vaccine, okay, confers better protection than a nucleocapsid vaccine, however, okay, in terms of not as severe. The spike vaccine confers acute protection in the lung, but not in the brain, okay? And combining spike and nucleocapsid vaccines improves distal protection in the brain. So there's a lot of very complicated data here on what's happening. I don't think we're going to work this out for some time because vaccines are waning, because we have to look at the damage inside the brains of humans, probably post-mortem and on CSF and cerebral spinal fluid samples before we're going to know. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you for your attention. Any questions?
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I mean, this was just amazing information. Very thorough.
It's not thorough. It's not very comprehensive. I just gave you some examples.
Well,
it's so much more.
Very high standards.
Yeah.
Excellent standard. Great presentation.
I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions. So go ahead and ask.
Can we retrain the brain to lessen the brain fog? Like doing a lot of word puzzles, Sudoku, mathematical programming, will that help in the brain fog? Training the brain.
There's actually I left this out, but that was one of the many things I left out. There's a number of things that are being investigated for treatments with the with the brain, and it's a little bit tricky. I mean, the thing you have to realize is that generally if you go online, there's a whole, people have asked me this constantly on social media. What can they do? Okay, what can they do to try to fix their brain fog, etc.? And you know, the best thing you can do for the brain probably is to exercise your body. Okay, that's the first thing that you do. And when I say exercise your body, of course, cardiovascular type improving exercise is the gold standard. But even just walking 20 minutes a day makes a difference. I don't know how many people know it, but if you walk 20 minutes a day, and it's reversible almost too. I mean, even if you start at older time in life, if you walk 20 minutes a day, you cut your chance of getting dementia by half. Dementia and Alzheimer's, one by half, one by 2/3. Okay, and it's the same thing. If these things are happening, exercise is there. Exercising your brain mentally, as you say, with word puzzles and things, is also known to help a lot with this. Of course, I mean, I'll guarantee you, diet helps with this. Okay, in some ways. But there's a number of treatments that are being developed that are more in different things like anti-neural antibodies that might, or immunotherapy to go after anti-neural antibodies. There's treatments of clots and amyloid microdots are being treated with different types of medicines. There's melatonin drugs that inhibit SARS from entering the brain and virus-induced damage of cerebral small vessels. There's vasointestinal peptide and PACAP, which are peptides that are known to help with neuronal injury. And there's also a really complicated, interesting paper in Nature Neuroscience on trying to reverse blood vessel and blood-brain barrier damage. And when there's something called RIPK, which might therapeutic target to treat the neuropathology of COVID-19. So there's a lot of things that are out there, and that's just a handful. I'm not an expert in treatments, okay, but when I gave the talk at Select Medical, I gave a talk to this bunch of medical personnel, and I figured I better go dig into it a little bit, and I found a list, and I have a list of references if anybody wants to send me a note.
All right, Andrew, we've got some great questions piling up here in the chat. I don't know if you know how to open the chat, but it's top left icon. We'll open it up.
Yeah, right. I see it. It's only opening. Oh, there it goes. Okay.
All right, so let's see here. Charles Yeager asks, is there any evidence that it's affecting driving ability?
Oh, I see. I'm at the bottom. Okay. Driving ability. You mean like driving a car?
I think he might mean driving a car. Yeah. Charles, you can unmute and speak for yourself if you'd like to.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. A car, a truck, a bus.
I would say, I don't know of any evidence that suggests that, but I would say if your cognitive abilities are being diminished, then it probably affects how you drive, and you probably need to retrain. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's, I don't want to say that someone with a high IQ drives better than someone with a low IQ, but they just train at different levels, and you would need to retrain.
As a follow-on question, sorry, Charles.
What other losses there besides IQ?
Oh no, but I mean, just imagine driving. I just used IQ as one example. I mean, but imagine driving with brain fog. Okay, I mean, this would not be a good thing. Okay,
yeah.
And I think there's much, or driving when you're easily fatigued. Okay, these are serious things with COVID. I mean, and in Sweden, it's illegal to drive when you're fatigued. So they classify it the same as drunk driving.
Wow.
So they claim they have studies that show that fatigued drivers are the same as drunk drivers. Of course, after all the history that's going on with the pandemic, I'm not sure I trust their studies on things like this, but I'm just joking. But I think it is pretty well established. Yeah.
One follow-on question is, what about pilots after COVID? Should they be recertified?
Oh wow. I think I think given the severity of what happens if something goes wrong with pilots, I would say yes, especially if they have severe COVID. I mean, you can see all of these things scale with severity. So I would say yes, they should be recertified. But getting them to actually do it is probably impossible. Okay.
All right. Next question. Thank you, Charles. That was a fun question. In a way. All right. From Colin, can you tell me more about the control group? Were they people with other non-COVID infections, or were they healthy? Colin, you might want to come on, and I'm not sure if we know which study you're referring.
Which study do you mean? Because
Colin, are you unmute?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, how are you? Yeah, just I noticed some of your slides. You'd I think it was the first 6 or 7 in there. There were some graphs relating the number of days after exposure to the virus to the likelihood of developing various cognitive impairments. And there was a green line, I think, relating to COVID sufferers, and another line relating to a control group.
Yep.
And you were showing an emerging difference that appeared to increase over time. You know, people with COVID seem to get progressively worse at a fairly alarming rate. And I'm just wondering who the controls were. Were they just random people, or were they other hospitalized patients with other infections that weren't COVID, or what? How did you assemble that group?
Well, none of this is my research. This is all my reading, but that's a great question, because I think you're talking about the psychiatric outcomes after COVID infection, and we were talking about hemorrhage and stroke and nerve root and plexus disorder, et cetera, dementia, and they all do go up faster than with the COVID patients. And the interesting thing with that slide, and I left it out, I was going too fast. The really interesting thing that slide is the red part, which is going up. Okay, that's the COVID. The blue part that goes up slower, that's not full control. That's a control. That's all other respiratory diseases. Okay, so it's flu, it's pneumonia, et cetera. It's all other respiratory diseases. So the COVID patients are going up that much faster than people who have other respiratory diseases. I mean, this is, I meant to say this because there's another reason I love this slide in this study, is that this is not, COVID is not a flu. Okay. All right. This is oh, okay. And so it's really interesting. And yet there's a huge difference. If you look at that compared to the general population, it's going to be even lower for the general population.
Okay, thanks.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Now, the controls with the memory, with the cognitive study, one of the things they've criticized that for is that the controls were people that they asked if they thought they had been infected, or if they knew they weren't. So it's not, the controls aren't perfect, but the pattern of the data is just, I can't believe that matters. So. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you, Andrew. So the next question from Caitlin Sundling. Are you aware of any autopsy studies planned to investigate COVID effects in post-COVID patients who die of other causes and without hypoxia? Caitlin, you can come off mute if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. And thank you for this great talk. I'm a pathologist. I'm not a neuropathologist, though, and I think one of the problems, or one of the issues you raised that has definitely been brought up, is that many of these autopsy studies, there are effects of acute and severe illness, patients who are in the ICU and experience hypoxia close to the time of their death, that may confound the issues and sort of make it difficult to tell what the specific COVID effects were. I was just wondering if you know of anyone looking in this area trying to follow these post-COVID patients who may have had, maybe mild disease and then die from something else.
There's, the place that you're going to find this is where in high incidence, what they need to do is to look at traffic accidents. Okay. People who died in traffic accidents. But I don't know of anybody who's done it yet, although I can't imagine it's not being done. The other place is the military. And the great example was the one I showed on the postmortem brain images with the 58-year-old woman who died from something else. And they found all these, but they realized she had COVID, and she had COVID, and then they saw all these plaques. Now, of course, it's almost anecdotal, because you don't know, maybe she was developing Alzheimer's already, early Alzheimer's. But I don't know of any that I've been told about. I have a recollection of seeing somewhere on maybe on social media or something, some group that was discussing this with the military for some study, but I don't know of any for sure. It'd be really, it has to be done. My recollection, my own memory might be disturbed because I might be filling in with a blank in my memory. You know, when you start to forget something, we automatically fill in with memories of what we think should be there. Okay, it's kind of like the frog DNA in Jurassic Park. But we actually do that in our brains, and it's well-known phenomenon. Always amuses me when people tell me, oh, I remember exactly 20 years ago. I'm like, yeah, okay. You remember exactly what you've synthesized to remember in there. But in any case, what that might be is what it might be is some discussion I've had with one of my discussion groups that this is what we should be doing. I'm not sure, but I know somebody's got to be doing it. I mean, it just makes so much sense. We need patients. We need to find motorcycle patients, you know, that would normally be giving. We call them in the U.S. I used to always call them donor mobiles, and you know, but we need people that are going to be donating by dying some other way and finding out that they were post-COVID. Yeah, but we don't have it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question from Wendy. Wendy, you can come off mute. So she's asking approximately how much reduction in long COVID. Actually, Wendy, there's a lot of feedback, so if you can go back on mute, I'm going to read your question. Okay.
Oh.
Should I unmute and read my question?
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, your sound was just a little bit funky. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So I was just thinking risk here, Andrew, you know, that if you are fully vaccinated, we're obviously not going to reduce fully your risk of long COVID, if I've understood your talk correct. But do we know, are we talking like a 50% reduction or a 90% reduction? Do we have much data on that yet? Fully vaccinated long COVID risk versus unvaccinated?
A study just came out this week that related to this and argued that it was that if you were fully vaccinated and boosted, that you had a much lower chance. But you know, I haven't had a chance to dig into it. I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of what we know, and this is because there's so many going in different directions, different studies saying yes, it does. No, it doesn't. The mouse study that I showed says it doesn't help at all. It's difficult to tell, and I think, you know, it's the same thing. Last June, maybe, when I put on Twitter something about vaccines not being sterilizing, and I got attacked. Okay, because the data early on said that they were, you know, everybody was saying they were 99%, and oh, these are these great vaccines, and blah 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 blah, and you know, it took time to figure out that they weren't 100%. And then when people started, I hesitated. I was more careful about talking about waning because we knew they were going to wane. The vaccines that have been developed for other coronaviruses always wane, and so we look at this. And so when you couple that in, I don't know what that's going to mean for the disease, okay? What in the brain. Now, also coupled into this is the fact that you have 3 different possible mechanisms for it to be damaging the brain, and it's probably doing all 3. Certainly, it's got the distal component. It looks as if it's got the direct infection component. It also is starting to look like it has the autoimmune component. And so it's going to depend on which vaccine, how much the waning affects each of those effects, each of those situations, and so forth, as to whether it's going to really do this. Okay, and so I think this is going to be a problem that's going to take a while to work out. And if you have and multiple infections, there's a wonderful paper by Don Ford on Substack. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's that he put out. It's written in more basic terms. Okay, it's some people call it complicated, but it's but I really like it. It was written in basic terms, and I'm putting the link on the chat. I just put it in there if you're interested in it.
That would be great. I'm sure we would love to see that. Thank you.
Yeah, and he talks about the long COVID and the multiple risks and the risks of multiple infections. And he has, I mean, some of it's speculation, some of it's real hard data. It's all coming together. But he mentions a little bit about vaccines in there. Okay, he's a little more pessimistic than I am. All right, which is, I'm a little pessimistic already. But I for long COVID. But I think, and he told me his next paper is going to be on COVID in the brain. So he's working on something with this now. So, yeah.
Andrew, just as a quick follow-up question to that. Why do you think that the governments are discussing so little about long COVID around the world, basically, and all going for this, just let it go?
Perhaps we could hold that question, Wendy. There's quite a few other questions that are queued up. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Okay. Julie Lamb is asking, is pointing out one of the, sorry, Andrew, I don't know if you really wanted to jump on that, but I wanted to get.
No, we could go on all night about that one.
Yeah, okay. So getting back to the medical science side of things. Long COVID, one of those symptoms Julie states here is insomnia. Might you be able to explain how the virus, what the virus is doing that is causing someone to not be able to sleep? And Julie, you can come off on mute to discuss this with Andrew if you'd like.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for your amazing presentation. And I recently got COVID, and one of the symptoms was I couldn't sleep for days. And yeah. I've been writing about long COVID and interviewing a lot of long COVID patients. And that seems to be a very common symptom. So besides like not able to sleep, people feel extreme fatigue though, like really tired. The fatigue is almost like a out of body kind of experience. Like you just not sure where it's coming from, that you just feel extremely tired, but unable to sleep, unable to lie down even, but like not able to sleep and getting hyperactive. So what's happening in the brain to cause that kind of strange reaction?
Well, I mean, that's a tough one. I don't think anybody really knows, but there's a couple of things I'll point to. One is there's a paper that I'm trying to remember where it is. I don't have the reference right in front of me, on melatonin. And melatonin, of course, is something that helps you with sleep. And melatonin apparently is one of the things they're talking about with therapy for this. So it may be that helps. It's somewhat controversial, but serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter, it's also involved in depression and anxiety and so forth. And although that's complicated in itself, serotonin is also, there's some beautiful work recently on showing that COVID causes serotonin release from platelets, and it's probably doing something in this sense to affect the brain. And what is this called? Is it called serotonin syndrome, or I think it's serotonin syndrome, and which is a sleeping issue. And so I think you'd have to look that up. I don't have that all right in front of me, but I'm guessing that's what it would be, but I don't really know.
All right.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll have to look for that.
Yeah, thanks for checking into that. That's a great question, Julie.
Yeah.
Really interesting what might be going on there. All right. Let's see. Colin, this may be a specific question. You might want to come off mute. This is a question about what contribution to the decrease in cognitive ability came from the severity, aggressive nature of ICU treatment itself? This sounds like it's a pretty specific question too.
Yeah, I think that was the fourth or fifth slide. It just showed a fairly remarkable increase in the level of cognitive impairment, if I can put it that way, comparing people with just a mild stay-at-home type of condition to people who were in hospital, and then to people who were in ICU, they seem to do the worst of all. And so I just wondered, is just the experience of being in hospital and being in an ICU, especially, that could be in itself fairly delirium inducing, couldn't it? I don't know.
It is. There's no question. I mean, this has been looked at in other diseases, and if you go into the ICU and ventilated, it's no question that it causes cognitive impairment. So, but part of it's probably from that, and that might be if you look at that slide, that slide, there's an enormous increase when you go with the ventilator. But but I have to say, you still have 3.3 units, standard deviation units, decrease if you're not put on a ventilator, and about 0.15 if you have assistance at home. And so, and there's a steady there's an increase there in all of these. If you look at that plot again too, it is somewhat exponential, or it's curved. It's not straight. And that is probably what you're seeing there. That's probably the larger, the amount more than if you take the linear progression across from the first, second, and third over, then you only get to about 0.2. Okay, so 3.5 points decrease in your IQ, or 5 years of aging. Okay, but then putting on the ventilator gives you double that. And that's probably what I would guess. But yeah, there are studies, and I've read them on people being put on ventilators and decreasing it. There's also, if you get put on a ventilator for a long enough period of time, you also start to form lesions in the brain and things like this. So there's no question that's part of it. But of course, if you get COVID and you get put on a ventilator, it's because you got COVID. So
fair enough. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot. That's good.
I don't want to be put on a ventilator.
No.
Well, I'm trying to stay away from the COVID. The thing is, if you get COVID, I mean, some of you have probably had it. If you get COVID, and my 18-year-old daughter just told me last night that she has COVID again, mild case. She's fully vaccinated in mild case, second time. And I told her, you got to avoid this. Read that Don Ford paper. I had given it to her before. It's you got to avoid the multiple. This is now that we're to the point that governments are so stupid in letting us get it, and that most of us are going to get it at least once. Now the issue is going to be, how do you keep yourself from getting it over and over again? If you get this 4 times a year, you're almost guaranteed to shorten your life a lot. Not by instant death, by the later death. So
reduce the life expectancy, right? COVID has already reduced.
It's already reduced it, but the reason it's already reduced it is really because what it's done is it's culled out a whole bunch of older people that were right near the edge that have pulled it down. You wait, the bigger effect on the life expectancy is when you're going to have 10 and 15-year-olds now getting Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and heart disease. And, even the mild infections, 2.3% of them have a heart problem within a year.
Mm-hmm. And the children are getting diabetics.
This is diabetes. A lot of children getting diabetes. I get furious when people keep calling it a respiratory disease. It is a respiratory disease, but it's not only. It's mainly a systemic disease.
Metabolism.
Thank you, Andrew. I don't know how much time you have. I know it's pretty late in Sweden. There's a few more questions, but but I also want to respect your time. So do you have time for a couple more questions, or
a couple more? Sure.
Okay, we'll do 2 more. So from Greta Fox, she's asking, is there any data on the acetylcholine esterase inhibitors as treatment?
I have not seen anything on that yet. I mean, of course, that's a standard way to treat Alzheimer's disease. And there are, in one of the papers that I read on treatments, there is, oh God, what happened? I mean, I don't know. I'd have to look to be sure, but there's. Let me see. Blood vessel. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure, because I know that they are talking, that there are papers where they say that we should be using certain treatments that are aimed at Alzheimer's now, and that's what these acetylcholinesterase inhibitors are hopeful for. But I don't know that anybody's actually done this and tried to see if it helps.
Thank you.
Remember, Alzheimer's disease is a really slow progressing disease until you get later on into it, and then it goes faster. And so it's troublesome. Okay, it's hard to, it's difficult to look at it and study it in this sort of acute sense. We're just 2 years into this disease.
Well, thank you. We have a final question. Thank you, Greta. Thank you, Andrew. We have a final question from Matt Rowe. He asks, are we looking at multiple separate degenerative conditions caused independently by aspects of SARS-CoV-2 infection, systematic immune modulation versus direct infection of neural cells versus mitochondrial dysregulation, similar to that seen in many neurological conditions? Matt, feel free to unmute and
yeah. Are you asking which way is this happening? I'm not sure I'm understanding the question.
Sort of just like, are the different manifestations of these symptoms that people are having, like brain fog versus fatigue versus, whatever else we're seeing, are they caused by separate types of damage being caused rather than a single effect of these infections?
Yeah, the data seems to be pointing in this direction. There's inflammation and reactive oxygen species, which I threw in there, and this is your mitochondrial activation. Okay, and there's no question that this is happening. Okay, there's distal inflammation type of that we're not sure exactly whether that's the same. Probably it's probably the same. There's from the lungs and from different species, but almost certainly that's what is happening. There's autoimmune, which I'm not as clear on. I mean, you should get Anthony Leonardi on here if you want to learn about autoimmune things. Okay, and then there's the direct infection, and I would say probably it's doing all of them. Okay, I mean, this is you couldn't design. The thing is you couldn't design a disease better, to attack the world than COVID, if you ask me. Okay. And the reason is because if you design a disease that just killed 40% of people, okay, 30 or 40% like SARS-1, okay, then people would shut it down. And they did. We did, right? The countries that had SARS-1, the countries that had MERS, they shut it down. Okay, they did a Yanir and they zeroed it. Okay, and the problem is that this disease is subtle, and so they allowed all the lunatics to let it rip, and yet it's gonna do immeasurable damage, and it's doing things in so many different directions at once. So when you talk about the inflammatory type of interactions and the direct interactions and the direct formation of clusters of proteins and things like this, all at once happening. They're not just the brain. This is happening in other places too. I mean, this is the what you said before. I mean, I saw, I think it was Anthony posted this thing up today or yesterday about the children with the lungs, or somebody, maybe you got it from you, Yanir, I don't know. And it's, this is really hitting everything. And so what you're going to find is you're going to have a bunch of disabled people. Just imagine. I mean, if you want to have control over the rest of the world, and the way we always used to say it was economic, right? Well, you mix economic with disabling people, and what happens? Okay. This is not a good thing. So, yeah. Anyway, a long answer. So, and Wendy, on your question about the world, I don't know what to think. I mean, I don't know what to think about why they're letting this happen. I have my own ideas, but I don't know if I should really say them here. But I mean, I think somehow there's big money behind this, and I don't think it's easy to fight it. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this tremendous conversation. Really appreciate your time.